Morning, everyone. So we are starting a new summer series called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. Now, if you're anything like me, when you've heard that topic, we've got one of two responses. One, finally, we are going to be talking about our emotions. We're going to get deep and vulnerable over the course of the summer. Or you're thinking, absolutely not. Anyway, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality is a book, and it's been written by Peter Scazzero. If you're the book type, if you want to read along with us, can I recommend the book to you? It is brilliant. It is worth investing in it. We're going to be doing it throughout the whole of the month of August together. So worth getting yourself a copy and read along with us. And essentially the premise of the book is that he is a pastor from New York City. And he decided to kind of go on this quest of really looking into his spiritual life. So he deepened his kind of reading of the scripture, he invested in his prayer life, he tried different spiritual disciplines out, and then he realised that actually whilst all of this was going on, the other side of his life kind of looked a bit chaotic. And so for example, his marriage was in a real mess. The church that he led was in chaos, and his inner life was pretty toxic. And he led him to kind of start thinking, how is this possible? I am pursuing you, God. This is not how it is meant to be. And yet. And what he eventually came to is the tagline of his book, which says, it is impossible to be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature. And the reality is that we are integrated beings. He kind of made this acknowledgement in the book, but we also know that to be true, don't we? We are integrated beings. Our spiritual life and our emotional lives, they go together, and we cannot separate the two out, no matter how much we may want to. We want to be people that are fully alive, emotionally alive, spiritually alive, socially alive. We want to be people that experience the whole of life. And if we're going to do that, then we have to pay attention to our inner worlds. We've got to be attentive to how our hearts are doing. In other words, this question becomes critical. How is your heart? Now, I just want to confess at this point, a few years ago in the Christian world, people walk up to you and they'd be like, how's your heart? How's your heart? Do you feel loved by Daddy God? And I would cringe inside. I actually hate it. And as I was writing this talk, I was trying to think of how else I could say this question without saying this question, because honestly, every bit of me feels a bit grim. And there's a reason for that. I'm an evangelist. I care about the non-Christians. And no one in the world goes up to each other, strangers, being like, how's your heart? You would think people were weird, right? But for this series, it matters. For this series, we want to ask the question, how is your heart? Because as I said, our emotional life and our spiritual lives are connected. And we want to take both of them seriously. We want to, as a church, take this seriously. We are aware that we live in a fast-paced city, right? That within this room, there will be multiple things going on, multiple pressures that we're experiencing. Maybe it's parenting and you're in the height of summer holidays. I was speaking to a parent earlier that was like, there's still weeks to go. I feel for you. I feel for you. And maybe it's the job hunt, maybe it's the workload, maybe it's making rent, maybe it's dating app fatigue, it's the disappointments and the rejections, maybe it's low-grade anxiety or possibly even crippling daily anxiety that you are going through, that even though we know Jesus, it can be hard to hold on to that promise that he offers us life in all of its fullness, right? So how is your heart? As I said, we want to take this seriously. And my hope and my prayer is that as we go on this journey over the summer, that we would get vulnerable, that we would be comfortable enough to get uncomfortable with each other and ultimately with God. And over the coming weeks, we're going to look at what does it look like to be our authentic selves. We're going to break the power of the past. We're going to look at grief and loss, and we're going to look at prayer and rest. But our starting point today is the problem of being emotionally unhealthy spiritually. So let's do a bit of a health check together. How are you feeling? Would you describe yourself as a bit of a feeler? Are you the kind of person that walks into the room and picks up all of the emotions in the room? Or are you on the other end of the scale? Are you more emotionally repressed? Do not bring your emotions near me. Thank you very much. They are a private affair and they are not to be done publicly. Or do you sit somewhere in the middle? How are you feeling? So 6 core emotions. As I was doing research for this, I realised there's actually a lot more, but these 6 are the ones I want to look at. Happiness, sadness, fear, disgust, anger, and surprise. Can you name the emotion of the week? What's been your dominant emotion, or how are you feeling this morning? Are you able to identify which one? Because if we're going to become more aware of how we're feeling, we have to take stock of the inner part of our hearts. We have to be able to name how we're feeling. Pete says this in the book: to feel is to be human. To minimize or deny what we feel is a distortion of what it means to be image bearers of God. To the degree that we are unable to express our emotions, we remain impaired in our ability to love God, others, and ourselves well. To feel is to be human. To feel is to be human. It is ultimately the way that we have been created. Back in Genesis 1, it says, so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. We have been created in the image of God. The image of an emotional God. You see, I think that emotions are expressed by God. In fact, he feels all of the feels. You only have to flick through the Old Testament to start with to see the emotions of God. He expresses anger, he expresses hurt, he expresses how much he loves people, he has compassion on people, he gives his heart away and his heart is broken, he is jealous for his people. God is an emotional God. And then you get to the New Testament, we've got Jesus, and the smallest verse in the Bible is Jesus wept. He laughs with his friends. He shows anger in the temple, and in the garden, he is overcome with sorrow. We worship an emotional God. Emotions are not just human, but they're also divine. So if we are going to be image bearers of God, if we are going to reflect the divineness of God in our everyday, we've got to get comfortable with our emotions. We have to understand the state of our inner selves, because we are created in the image of an emotional God. By him, for his work. So for us to feel more fully alive, for us to feel more fully human, we have to be fully alive spiritually, intellectually, socially, and also emotionally, as I've said. And if we choose to ignore any aspect of this, then it has an impact on ourselves, on the relationships we have with others, and also with God. You see, God is interested in the whole of us, the multidimensional beings that we are, because that is how he has chosen to create us. And so God grants you the permission to feel all the feels. How often are you asked, how are you? And do you respond, good, fine, busy? Now, not last week, because I was on holiday relaxing on the beach, so I generally was very good. But the week before that, I decided to track how many times was I asked, how are you? And how many times I responded, good. 9 out of 10 times did I respond, good, and you? It was like a button being switched in my head. I couldn't help it. Even though I was trying to be really aware of what I was being asked, I still found myself saying, good, and you? And there are obviously times that that's an appropriate response, but there's also times when it is my default position and I don't really want to tell you what's going on beneath the surface. We're made up of multiple layers, and often we're only willing to show people the very tip of the iceberg. So Pete, in his book, goes into this in more detail, but what he says is, you've got the top 10%, and that really is what we're willing to show people. The way we act, the way we speak, the way we dress, the kind of social side of ourselves that we're willing to allow people access to. We all commonly do that. And then there's the other 90% that lives beneath the surface. The feelings, the thoughts, the beliefs, the desires, which cause us to act the other 10%, right? It informs the 10% we show people. But it's what's going on beneath the surface that's interesting. And God is deeply concerned with our 90%. Don't get me wrong, he cares about that 10% we show publicly, but I think he really cares about that 90%. And so I wonder how comfortable you are allowing God access to all of you, the whole of you, the innermost workings of your heart. Or is there a distance there? Because it's the hidden stuff, that 90%, that can cause us to become emotionally unhealthy spiritually. According to me, Pete, our new best mate, there are 10 signs of being emotionally unhealthy spiritually. I'm going to go through them one by one, but I just want to open by saying it's an uncomfortable list. And I say that because when I started reading it, I literally was like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to look at this talk anymore. I don't want to do this talk anymore, because it felt quite exposing. And I'll be honest with you, to the ones that I could easily identify. And as we go through the list, I encourage you to pay attention, to note the ones that feel a bit familiar to you. So let's begin. Using God to run from God. Do you spend hours reading scripture and theology books, but not actually allow God access to your inner life? Do you use Bible verses to justify your behaviors? Do you use God to actually keep God distant? It's a clever one, this one, I think. I read it and was like, definitely not. And then as I thought about it a bit more, I was like, oh yeah, definitely at times. Ignoring anger, sadness, and fear, this often can go back to the former things we experience in life. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more. But were you taught that anger, sadness, or fear are negative emotions? Were you taught that they're just not biblical? You should not be expressing or feeling them, actually. Is anger dangerous to you? Is it unloving? Or does sadness indicate a lack of faith? Or fear? Well, the Bible says do not fear, so there is no reason for you to fear, because the Bible says do not. Dying to the wrong things. Of course we're meant to die to the sinful sides of ourselves. Absolutely. We die to that side. We're born again with Christ and we're raised to new life with him. But we're not meant to die to the healthy parts of ourselves. The healthy desires that we have, the pleasures of life, the joy that we experience. God plants these desires and hopes within us. And he intends us to be the most truest version of ourselves with them. But are you dying to the wrong things? Denying the impact of the past on the present, and we're going to have an entire week on this. But we need to process the stuff of our past, right? We've all got past. Let's not pretend that we don't. We might have them to greater depths or that, but we all have them. And we need to break the negative patterns of behavior and thoughts so that we can claim our freedom in Jesus. Dividing life into the secular and the sacred. We have this uncanny ability to compartmentalize. We do God on a Sunday and maybe in our small group, but my word, the rest of the week I don't even talk about my faith. Doing for God instead of being with God. This was probably my number one. We love being productive in our society, don't we? Any of us that identify as a perfectionist like myself, this is going to be a pitfall for us. Because the church is no different, but we are fundamentally called to be with God, not doing for God. Are you on every single team going so that you can be present at church, but not actually have to be present at church? You know, that's okay for a while if you need to do that. Genuinely it is. But it's not a long-term strategy. That one also is often linked to self-worth. Just to say, Pete goes into a lot more details of these in his book, so it's worth doing it. But God's desire is for us to find rest in his presence. What about this one? Spiritualizing away conflict. Conflict happens in all areas of life, doesn't it? Family life, relationships, workplace, classrooms, neighborhoods, you name it, it's going on. So what's your response to areas of conflict in your life? What do you do with it? Overcoming brokenness, weakness, and failure. Do you feel the pressure to present as spiritually strong? Or are you able to own the fact that we all have weaknesses? Living without limits. Do you feel guilty for not doing enough? This can often lead to us feeling discouraged or isolation or disengagement. Do you thrive in being busy? 12 years ago when I joined the staff team, lovely Jenny Peters gave me a book called Boundaries by Clouds. It's a fantastic book, but when I gave it to her, I was like, I do not need that. I know what boundaries is. And she literally just said back to my face, you don't even know what a boundary is. You've got none. And she could not have been more true, but no one had said that to me. And actually at the beginning, I totally was like, no. It took me a long time to get around to reading it. I love a boundary. We are not meant to live life without limits. We are not God. We need healthy boundaries. Finally, judging other people's spiritual journey. Do you live an us versus them reality? Is that something that would apply to you? It's an uncomfortable list, like I said. But did some stand out for you? Let's go back to our core emotions for a bit. Happiness, sadness, fear, disgust, anger, and surprise. Which ones do you like? Which ones do you like? Yeah, I don't mind expressing that emotion. I quite like anger. I think it's a great emotion. I'm someone who loves that feeling. It's all right. But what about the ones that make you feel unsafe? What about the ones that you're not so comfortable to express? For me, it's sadness. Growing up in my family, if you were sad, you got brought a present to cheer you up. I thought this was completely normal. Not only that, and I've only really done the maths on this more recently, when you're sad in my family, even if the thing in front of us is affecting the whole family, even if it is desperately sad, you take yourself off to deal with your sadness. You do not cry in front of each other. It's a private thing. Okay, we don't offer comfort to each other. And when I was writing this talk and I was thinking about what do I do with sadness, friends of mine know this about me. And so every so often, if I'm like, I've brought this new thing, they will say to me, do you think you're a bit sad? Because it's this inbuilt lesson that I have. It's not a conscious decision. It's just like, yeah, buy that. Great, feel a bit better for a little bit. Then the sadness comes back. So it's this horrible, vicious cycle. Not only that, but for a long time, I struggled to accept comfort in my sadness. One of my best friends, Lisa, would hold me, and I would be like, and you do the pat, don't you, to signal the hug has ended. And she would not let go. And I've learned over time that actually to be comforted in my sadness is a healthy thing. Do you relate to that? What lessons did you learn early on in life that still affect us today? Maybe it's anger for you. Maybe actually anger is an emotion you cannot do. If someone gets angry, it's uncomfortable. You don't know what to do with your anger. Do not shout or get mad. Maybe it's happiness. Someone said to me recently, do you know what, growing up, if I was really, really happy, like full of joy, I'd be told to calm down. Just calm down a little bit. That's a bit too much for us. And now they actually find it really hard to express true joy, true happiness. Maybe it's fear. Maybe you did grow up being told, it's just unbiblical. God, you don't need to fear because you've got God. So you don't need to fear. You don't need to have that emotion. The reality is that we will have all learnt these lessons early on in life, and then we carry them into adulthood where they continue to impact our emotional health. And so often we try and numb the uncomfortable emotions, don't we? Brené Brown, I was trying to find this clip, but unfortunately we couldn't get it up. So I'm going to read this clip to you. She does it in her first ever TED Talk. It's kind of the one that went viral. And she says this: we are the most in-debt, obese, addicted, and medicated in American history. Let's apply the same to the UK because we know it'd be true. She's talking about us as a culture. The problem is that you cannot selectively numb the emotion. You can't say, here's the bad stuff. Here is vulnerability, here is grief, here is shame, here is fear, here is disappointment. I don't want to feel these things. I'm going to have a couple of beers and a banana nut muffin. You can't numb these hard feelings without numbing the other effects. You cannot selectively numb. And so when you numb those, you also numb joy and gratitude and happiness. And then you feel miserable. And then you search for meaning and purpose. And then you feel vulnerable. And then we have to have a couple more beers and a banana nut muffin. But maybe for you it isn't a couple of beers and a banana nut muffin. Maybe it's an extra glass of wine. Maybe it's the descent into the Netflix series, the podcast series, cleaning, shopping, porn, drugs, anything to numb that emotion that you do not want to feel. And let's be honest, we will all have this going on at various times in our life. The problem is that when we do that, as Brené says, we numb the other emotions too. But there's good news. Neuroscience has shown us that through self-reflexivity, we can learn to sit in the discomfort of the emotions we don't like. And when we do that, our brain is able to forge new pathways that become more instinctive to us. We can learn healthier behaviors and responding to our emotions. So for me, sadness is the one that I really don't like. I still don't like it. I don't think I'm ever going to be okay with it, to be truthful. But I am better at responding to it. I notice if I'm buying stuff, and I check myself. I allow others to come and comfort me when I feel sad. My safest people are allowed to do so. More than that, I've noticed that when I'm with my family and they're sad, I can attempt to help them. I can hold my mum when she's crying about something. She doesn't like it. My mum is like, but I'll hold her still because I've learned, this affected me in a healthy way and I'm going to help you too. And as Christians, the good news is that we do not have to do it alone. We do it with Jesus and by the power of the Spirit. So back to our question, how is your heart doing? The story of the prodigal son is one that we probably know well, and I'm not going to read it all out to us, but I do want to highlight a couple of bits. Let me briefly explain it just in case you don't know it. It's Jesus is telling some parables to his disciples, and the key figures are there's his father and the two sons, and the youngest son says to the father, I want my money and my inheritance so I can go off and live a rock and roll lifestyle for a while. The thing is, they're Jewish, and actually that was incredibly shaming. It meant he said to him, essentially, Dad, I think you're dead to me. But the dad, he gives the money to the son and off he goes. And eventually the son goes off and he lives his rock and roll lifestyle and eventually he hits rock bottom. He ends up living with pigs. And remember, he's Jewish, so he is absolutely in the depths of shame. And this is the verse that I think is interesting. It says, when he came to his senses, when he listened to his inner life, when he took stock of his heart, that's when change came. Then he goes back to his dad. Interestingly, when he's kind of coming up with this idea, as you can see in the verses, and he's thinking, I'm going to go home, it isn't my dad's going to welcome me back with open arms. That isn't what his view is. His view is, I'm going to go back and work. His self-worth is low. And I think when he asks his dad for his money, it reflects a lot about how he feels anyway. This kid is not in a good place from the beginning of this story. Watch the father's response. The father says, I saw him and was filled with compassion for him. Not condemnation, but compassion. Doesn't mind what's happened. He's so pleased his son has come back. He throws a party for his son. And then you get the older son. And the older son, who's stuck around the whole time, he becomes angry. And the father notices the heart of his older son too. He's seen the heart of his younger son. He's had compassion for him. He's welcomed him back. He's thrown him a party. He's back in the family fold at his rightful place. And then he spots his older son. The father goes to him and he says, you are always with me in everything I have for yours. In other words, son, all the compassion and rejoicing that I have for your little brother, I have for you too and always have done. And the reason that Jesus tells this story is because he says, how is your heart? How are you doing? Are you coming to me with how you're feeling, or are you choosing to run from me? The Father in the story is the representation of God. And even if you are with Jesus, what's your view of yourself? Do you expect less than the true love of the Father? This phrase I love: find the door of your heart and you will discover the door of the kingdom. You see, our hearts and our response to the kingdom, our understanding of how much God loves us, they are fundamentally linked. They are interconnected. Earlier when we looked at the iceberg and we looked at the 10% and the 9%, it is the 90%, as I said, that God is most interested in. What is going on beneath the surface of our lives? Are we willing to allow God access to bring true healing to us, full freedom, full life in all of the power of the Spirit? Or are we slightly closed off from God? You see, I think self-awareness matters, knowing what's going on inside of us so that we can see, actually, are we feeling emotionally unhealthy spiritually? Or are we in an okay place? In Matthew's gospel, Jesus tells another story about the state of our hearts in response to the kingdom. And he's talking about the conditions of the soil to grow seeds. And I'm not going to read it to us, but I do want to pick up a couple of things. It's in Matthew 13 if you want to read it for yourself. But basically, there's a farmer and he's throwing seeds out there, and some land on hard soil, some land on kind of rocky land, and others land on good soil. And essentially what Jesus is saying to them is, take stock of the state of your heart in response to the kingdom. Take stock of it. And he says, some of you have got hard hearts. You've closed your heart off to the news of the kingdom, this good news for you. And maybe it's because of your life experience, and maybe you've never experienced Jesus and you just don't know the goodness that is there for you. Some of us have got shallow hearts, like, yeah, we know Jesus, but actually we lack the depths of faith. So when life's good, we can experience joy, but when it's not, we are so quickly thrown off path. We quickly turn away from God. And for some of us, our hearts are so cluttered that although we know Jesus, actually our hearts, they're full of our anxieties, our worries, and the busyness of life, that we just simply forget to turn to him. Or maybe we just don't even know how to turn to him, how to let Jesus into the depths of our soul. And Jesus said, healthy hearts is what I'm looking for and what I can offer to you. We do this with Jesus. And it's healthy hearts that are the best for the kingdom. They're the ones that allow us to go, do you know what? I know that I'm loved by God. I know in the depths of my sadness, Jesus is with me. He's not rushing me out of it. He's with me in the midst of it. Proverbs 4 says, also above all else, guard your hearts, for everything you do flows from it. To be attentive to your inner world, what is going on in your innermost being. This series is not just about theory and heavy theology, it's about the practicalities of how we are going to be emotionally healthy spiritually together. Brené Brown has a phrase when she thinks about her emotional health. It's an amazing article. I'd highly recommend reading it. She talks about sort of going through COVID and various things that have gone on. She noticed that emotionally she wasn't doing so well. And she says this: the strong back, the soft front, and the wild heart, that's what we need to be aiming for. And the strong back, she says, it's grounded in confidence and in boundaries. And the soft front, it's staying vulnerable and curious. And the marker of a wild heart is living out these paradoxes in our lives. And we're not going to give in to either one. And we're not going to give in to any situation that might reduce us down. But we're going to do this. And the thing is, when we trade in our soft backs and our strong backs and our soft fronts and our wild hearts, we end up with guarded backs and defended fronts and an armored heart. And I think when we think about this in the Christian world, we need to have strong backs, ones that are built on the confidence of the good news of the gospel, that Jesus will always meet us where we're at, that he comes to us, that he has the power to set us free from anything that's entangling us, that we want to have soft fronts that are so vulnerable to Jesus, that are open to him, open to the power of the Spirit to come into the very depth of who you are, to give him full access to that 90%. To allow him to do the inner healing work that some of us might need to do, knowing that he'll never shame or condemn us, but meet us with compassion. And if we can do those things, then I think we'll end up with wild, kingdom-focused hearts. So let me start where I began. Where's your heart at? How are you feeling this morning? How much access do you want to give to Jesus at the start of this series?